There comes a moment in every quietly exhausted life when caring stops feeling like compassion and starts feeling like erosion. Not because the heart has hardened, but because the mind has simply run out of space to hold everything it once carried without question. It happens slowly, so slowly that a person rarely notices the shift. The smile that feels heavier, the thoughts that move slower, the once soft instinct to help that now trembles under the weight of its own expectation. People often assume that caring is endless. Those who give will always give, that empathy replenishes itself. But even the gentlest soul can reach a point where kindness becomes a hidden burden, and love begins to feel like fatigue disguised as duty. This is the story of what happens when someone cares too deeply, long after their mind has nothing left to give. Asterisk. It rarely begins with a dramatic collapse. There is no sudden moment where a person realizes they've given too much, cared too deeply, or stretched themselves thinner than the mind can tolerate. The unraveling is far quieter than that. It begins in the spaces no one pays attention to, the pause before answering a message, the breath held a second too long, the heaviness behind a smile that once came naturally at first. It feels like ordinary tiredness, the kind anyone might experience after a long week. But ordinary tiredness rests when it can. This kind does not. This kind follows a person into their sleep, into their morning, into the moments that should have been peaceful but somehow feel edged with pressure. The mind, once soft and spacious, begins to feel crowded. Thoughts move slowly, as if wading through fog. Emotions that used to rise easily now feel blunted, not because they've disappeared, but because the mind cannot afford to feel them fully anymore. It's too much. Everything is too much. This is the beginning of caring beyond one's capacity, a state where the heart keeps reaching outward even as the mind whispers that there is nothing left to give. People who care deeply never imagine this moment will come. They think exhaustion is something that happens to others. They believe kindness is bottomless. They assume that love, empathy, and responsibility regenerate endlessly, simply because the intentions behind them are good. But even the most generous mind has limits. Even the most patient heart grows tired. The slow unraveling often looks invisible from the outside. To others, they appear the same, dependable, warm, willing to help. Only they know that something inside no longer feels steady. Only they notice the small cracks forming in their previously unshakable calm. There might be moments of confusion. Why does this feel harder than it used to? Why am I so icily overwhelmed? Why do simple things feel heavy? Questions whispered internally, rarely spoken aloud. And underneath those questions lies something quieter, almost frightening, a fear that if they stop caring, even for a moment, everything around them will fall apart. They don't realize yet that the thing most at risk of falling apart is themselves. The unraveling continues in ways subtle enough to be dismissed. Delayed response because the mind needs a moment to brace itself. A sudden desire to withdraw from conversations. A strange numbness during emotional moments that previously stirred something deep. A sense of watching life instead of participating in it. People often assume that burnout is loud, explosive, obvious. But emotional burnout from caring too much is silent. It doesn't shout, it fades. It fades in the way hope becomes hesitation. In the way generosity becomes obligation. In the way connection becomes weight, the person begins to feel stretched thin, as if each request pulls a thread from them, one they cannot easily replace. They say yes, while their mind whispers, "Please don't ask me." They show up even when their inner world is begging for pause. They care because caring has always been their nature, even as their capacity quietly collapses beneath the surface. And yet, despite the exhaustion, they rarely allow themselves to acknowledge the truth, that they are tired in a way sleep cannot fix. Tired in a way silence cannot soothe. Tired in a way that comes only from giving more than the mind can hold. This chapter is the beginning. The recognition, the moment the cracks begin to show, though gently, subtly, like hairline fractures in a glass that still appears whole. A person who cares too much never realizes they are unraveling until they have already begun to lose pieces of themselves. This is where their story starts. In the quiet collapse beneath outward calm, in the invisible tiredness carried alone, in the fragile truth that even the kindest hearts can break when the mind has nothing left. Asterisk, asterisk. No one becomes a chronic caretaker by accident. The habit of overgiving does not appear suddenly in adulthood. It is shaped long before a person has the language to describe it. In places where they were still learning what love meant and what was required to keep it, it often begins in childhood. In quiet homes, where emotions moved carefully, or loudly, or not at all, children observe more than they speak. They learn the rules of belonging without anyone having to write them down. Some learn that love is safest when they are useful. Some learn that peace is maintained by anticipating needs before they are spoken. Some learn that their own feelings are secondary, distractions, inconveniences, or luxuries they must set aside for the sake of others. These lessons, absorbed long before conscious memory, form a quiet script inside them. To be loved, you must take care. To stay safe, you must stay attentive. To matter, you must give. And so, they grow into adults who mistake overfunctioning for connection. Perhaps they were the child who comforted a parent overwhelmed by life, or the child who minimized their needs so they wouldn't add to the chaos, or the child who learned that expressing discomfort resulted only in disappointment or silence. Some were praised for being mature for their age, not realizing that maturity was simply a mask for emotional neglect. Care became their currency, their offering, their identity. They might have been the responsible sibling, the quiet listener, the peacekeeper in a home that depended on their calm. These roles, once survival strategies, solidified into personality traits others admired, but rarely understood the weight of, and the child who learned to carry. Emotional burdens grows into the adult who does it automatically, reflexively, unquestioningly. Even later in life, this early conditioning continues to shape them in ways they barely notice. They feel guilty when they rest. They feel anxious when someone else is in distress. They feel responsible for fixing what was never theirs to fix. They feel uncomfortable being on the receiving end of care. They feel safest when giving, even if it drains them. It is not that they want to care too much. It is that they were built around it. Their emotional wiring was shaped by a world that taught them that. Withholding their needs protected the people they loved. And so, without knowing it, they carry this belief into every relationship, every friendship, every dynamic they enter. If someone they love is hurting, they respond before they think. If someone needs support, they set aside their exhaustion. If someone demands emotional labor, they absorb it as if it's their responsibility. This is not generosity alone. It is adaptation, one that began long ago. Sometimes the origin is even subtler. A parent who praised selflessness but struggled with vulnerability. A family where emotional needs were present but rarely named. A culture that equated sacrifice with virtue. A community where quiet suffering was honored more than honest expression. These influences carve deep grooves into the mind. And the adult who emerges from such environments often cannot tell the difference between compassion and compulsion. They believe the role they play is who they are. They believe their value lies in their ability to hold others. They believe that caring is the only way they know how to exist. What they fail to realize is that their mind, even from childhood, never learned how to receive care, only how to give it. And when someone spends a lifetime carrying emotional weight without knowing how to set it down, the load becomes heavier than they ever expected. This chapter reveals the foundation, the beginning of a lifelong pattern. The tenderness of a child who cared too much. The vulnerability of a person shaped by early emotional responsibilities. The quiet evolution of someone who learned that caring was not simply an act, but a survival instinct. Asterisk. Asterisk. There is a point where caring shifts from a feeling to a function, from something chosen to something performed. Psychology calls it many names: emotional over-responsibility, compassion fatigue, chronic hypervigilance, but for the person living inside it. The experience is simple: a mind that cannot stop giving, even when it has nothing left to understand why. One must look not only at emotion, but at biology. The human brain is wired to respond to distress, its own or someone else's. But in some people, especially those conditioned to prioritize others from a young age, the alarm system fires differently when they sense someone's frustration, sadness, or disappointment. Their nervous system reacts as if there is imminent danger. The amygdala lights up. Stress hormones surge. The body braces itself, not for physical harm, but for emotional imbalance. A type of threat they learned long ago could destabilize the world around them, so they rush to soothe, to fix, to balance. It is not simply kindness. It is nervous system survival. Their brain has learned to equate emotional tension with risk. A sigh becomes a warning. A shift in tone becomes a signal. A frown becomes an urgent problem to solve. Even the possibility of someone else's disappointment feels overwhelming. Not because they fear consequences, but because their brain believes the burden is theirs. This is the psychology of overgiving. A miscalibrated responsibility system that assigns them roles they were never meant to hold in healthy emotional functioning. Empathy has boundaries. A person feels with another, but does not merge with them. They care, but they are still separate. But for those who care too much, separation doesn't come naturally. Their mirror neurons, the circuits responsible for understanding others, fire intensely, sometimes excessively. They feel emotions almost as if they are their own. And because the feeling is so real, the urge to relieve it feels urgent. Over time, its constant emotional absorption depletes the brain's regulatory systems. Cortisol remains elevated. Mental energy drains faster than it restores. The mind loses the buffer that once existed between self and other. That is why exhaustion arrives long before they notice it. Why they feel heavy without understanding why? Why their sense of self becomes fuzzy, blurred at the edges, worn thin from over-identifying with the needs around them. Psychologists describe this as role diffusion. It's a blurring of emotional boundaries that makes a person feel partly responsible for everyone. Not because they choose to, but because their brain never learned how not to. And when this pattern continues for years, perhaps decades, something deeper happens. The internal reward system becomes tied to service. Dopamine. The chemical associated with pleasure begins to respond not to rest, not to personal joy, but to relieve tension in others. The feeling of I helped becomes the only reliable source of internal calm. Anything else feels empty, even wrong, so they keep giving, even when tired, even when numb, even when a quiet, aching part of them longs to be held instead of holding. This psychological mechanism creates a painful paradox. The more someone cares, the more exhausted they become, and the more exhausted they become, the harder it is to stop caring. Stopping feels like abandoning. Rest feels like selfishness. Boundaries feel like cruelty, and the mind, already worn thin, cannot distinguish the difference between emotional responsibility and emotional captivity. This is why the dark side of caring too much is not simply emotional. It is neurological. It is how the brain learns to function, how identity becomes intertwined with sacrifice, how giving becomes not an act of love, but a reflex taught by survival. Yet beneath this complexity lies a simple human truth. The mind, no matter how generous, was never built to carry more than its share. And those who care too much often do so because somewhere in their wiring, caring became the only way they knew how to exist. Asterisk, asterisk. Not because of its size, not because of the silence, but because something was shifting, quietly, beneath every floorboard, every breath. Every glance exchanged between the people Natalie once called family, she watched. Olivia stir a pot on the stove, hands shaking, stirring too fast, spilling a little without noticing. Thomas sat on the couch staring at nothing, eyes glazed, jaw locked tight. Daniel paced the hallway like a trapped animal, shoulders stiff, fingers pulling at his own hair. Natalie knew the reason. She had told them the truth. She had signed the papers, she had changed her will, and the reality was settling in like a cold, uninvited guest. The conversation that burst the quiet. "I just don't get it." Thomas snapped suddenly, his voice slicing the air. "You're punishing us. That's what this is. After everything we've done for you." Natalie flinched. Done for her? All she had seen lately were requests, demands, entitlement. Daniel stepped closer, anger boiling in his eyes. "So what? You're leaving everything to outsiders now? People who aren't blood?" "That's insane, Mom. Blood." The word tasted sour in her mouth. She thought of all the nights she had cried alone. All the appointments they canceled because it was too far. All the times they discussed her health care like it was an expense, not a duty. Olivia slammed the pot lid down. "We're your children. How can you not trust your own family with your legacy?" Natalie inhaled deeply. "My legacy," she said softly, "is not money. It's who I choose to honor." The realization that changed EVR, white, Kainji, the room froze. "You said," Natalie whispered, voice trembling but firm. "You said you wished I would hurry up and sort out my will, that you were tired of waiting, that you needed to know what you would get." She looked at each of them. "You didn't ask how I was feeling. Not once. You only asked what you would receive." Thomas opened his mouth, but no words came out. Daniel leaned back against the wall, breath unsteady. Olivia looked like she'd been slapped. "I realized something," Natalie continued. "You love the idea of my wealth, but not me." The truth hung in the air like smoke, heavy, unavoidable. "The explosion, you're being dramatic," Daniel hissed. Thomas stood, fists clenched. "So that's it? You're cutting us out because we weren't emotional enough?" Natalie shook her head slowly. "I'm not cutting you out. I'm protecting myself and giving everything to strangers." Olivia demanded. "Not strangers. People who were there when you weren't, their faces twisted, anger, shock, fear, because now, it wasn't just money. It was power, control, legacy, and they were losing it." The confession. She never eeks. Pisa Thomas suddenly stepped forward, eyes fierce. "Fine. You want the truth?" He spat. "We earned that money. You wouldn't have any of it if it weren't for us. We took care of the house, helped Dad when he was sick, and we deserve our share." Natalie froze. "Deserve?" she whispered. Daniel nodded sharply. "Yeah, it's basically ours anyway. You're just holding it." She felt her knees weaken. Not just entitlement, but ownership. They didn't see her as a mother anymore. They saw her as a vault. The heartbreak, a tear escaped her eye, and for the first time, none of them reached to wipe it. None of them moved closer. None of them cared. She wasn't their mother in this moment. She was a will. She was paperwork. She was a number with a dollar sign. The turning pow on Tish straightened her spine. "If that's how you feel," she said quietly, "then I made the right decision." Thomas scoffed. Daniel cursed under his breath. Olivia stormed back to the stove, and the house, once warm, once full of memories, felt like a battlefield of ghosts. Natalie walked to her room slowly, heart aching, but something inside her had also awakened. Strength, self-respect, clarity, for the first time in years. She wasn't scared of losing them, because she finally understood they weren't hers to lose. They were already gone. Natalie barely slept. The house creaked all night, footsteps in the hallway, cupboards opening, whispered conversations behind doors. Not a single one of them spoke to her directly, but she could feel the resentment rising like steam beneath the floorboards. By morning, the kitchen was quiet again, too quiet. Thomas sat at the table with a coffee he wasn't drinking. His eyes were red, whether from anger or tears she couldn't tell. Daniel scrolled through his phone aggressively, jaw twitching each time the screen lit up. Olivia stood by the window with her arms crossed so tightly they shook. Natalie walked in, her heart heavy but steady. She knew something had shifted overnight. She just didn't know how much. The first strike. A question they shouldn't have. Ace Daniel looked up first. A thin, cold smile curved on his lips. "So," he said, voice dripping with bitterness, "just to be clear, who exactly are you leaving everything to?" Natalie froze. She hadn't told them the names, only that the will had changed. Thomas leaned forward, elbows on the table. "Yeah, Mom, we deserve to know. Since apparently we're not considered family anymore." Olivia didn't speak, but her eyes were burning. Natalie placed her hand on the counter to keep herself steady. "It's not something I'm discussing," she said softly. "That decision is mine." Daniel scoffed loudly. Thomas slammed his fist on the table. "You're avoiding the question. The second strike." The line "they CROSSI" to Natalie turned to walk away, but Daniel's voice stopped her cold. "Is it your caretaker? The neighbor? That charity woman you keep talking to? Who stole you from us?" She whipped around. "Stole me," she repeated. Thomas sneered. "That's what people do, Mom. They take advantage of old women who don't know better. Old women? Taught no better." The words hit her harder than any slap could. Have her fingers curled into a trembling fist. "I am not confused," she whispered. Daniel raised an eyebrow. "Are you sure about that?" Olivia finally spoke, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. "You're being manipulated. That's the only explanation. Because no mother would betray her own children like this." Natalie felt something inside her break. Not a crack, a snap. The third strike, what they really wanted. "You talk about betrayal," she said, the voice suddenly cold. "Yet everything you've asked me for, every visit, every call, every question, has been about money." Thomas stood up. "That's because you never share anything with us." He exploded. "We're your kids. We have a right to know what we're inheriting. Inheritance, not health, not happiness, not love. Inheritance." Natalie swallowed hard. "I didn't raise you to think this way," she whispered. Daniel shook his head. "You didn't raise us to be broke either." Olivia exhaled shakily. "We just want what's fair." "Fair," Natalie repeated. "Fair was giving you my time, my home, my sacrifices, my entire life." She looked at each of them. "You took everything while I was alive. Now you want what's left when I'm gone." Silence. But not the peaceful kind. The kind before a storm. The confrontation that changed EVRY. Kionis suddenly stepped toward her too close, too fast. "Mom," he said quietly, "you need to change the will back." Natalie didn't move. He reached out slowly, deliberately, and placed a hand on her shoulder. Not lovingly, but like someone closing a door, firm, controlling. Daniel blocked the doorway. Olivia watched, breathing heavily, tears threatening, but never falling. Natalie felt her heartbeat pound against the inside of her ribs. This wasn't a conversation anymore. This was pressure. This was coercion. This was fear. "Mom," Thomas repeated, voice low. "Fix this before it gets worse." The moment she saw their true faces, Natalie looked up at her eldest son, the boy who once cried when he scraped his knee, the boy she carried to bed when he fell asleep on the couch, the boy who used to bring her dandelions, calling them sunflowers. But this wasn't that boy. This was a man who believed her life was his property. A man who thought intimidating her was the solution. A man whose love had strings attached so tight she could barely breathe. The voice came out as a whisper. "No." He stared at her. Daniel's eyes widened. Olivia gasped softly. Thomas's jaw ticked. "No." He repeated, as if the word was foreign. "No," she said again. "I won't change my will." The SHETTR neighed. Thomas stepped back, hands shaking, not with hurt, with rage. Daniel cursed under his breath. Olivia turned away, covering her mouth. Everything felt frozen. And then Thomas kicked the kitchen chair, so hard it toppled and slammed into the cabinets. "Fine," he shouted. "Then don't expect us to stick around." Natalie's heart cracked, not because of what he said, but because of how true it already was. They hadn't been around in years, they were only here now. Because of the will, They didn't come for her. They came for the finale. The DEPARTU. They didn't pack. They didn't say goodbye. They didn't ask if she was okay. They just stormed out one after the other, slamming the door so hard she felt it in her chest. The house trembled, and when the silence finally settled, Natalie sank into the chair they had knocked over, her head in her hands, her breath shaking, her heart breaking. Not because she had lost her children, but because she realized she had never truly had them to begin with. The house was silent after they left. Not the silence of emptiness. Natalie had known that kind for years. This was different. This was the silence that follows a storm that didn't destroy the land, only revealed what was already broken. She sat alone at the kitchen table, the air still trembling from slammed doors and unspoken accusations. The morning light came in uncertain and pale, touching the edge of the table, her hands, the fallen chair she hadn't picked up. For the first time, she didn't rush to fill the quiet with apologies or hope. She let it linger. She let herself feel what she had spent a lifetime outrunning. The grief, the anger, the relief, but underneath all of it, something softer, something she hadn't felt in so long she almost didn't recognize it. A strange, trembling peace. The body remembers even when the heart behind her chest still ached where fear had tightened it. Her shoulders still burned from being squared against her own children. Her voice still felt raw from speaking truths she had never dared to say aloud. But her breath came easier now. The kind of breath that doesn't seek permission. The kind that doesn't wait for someone to approve it. The kind that belongs only to the one breathing it. Natalie ran her hand along the grain of the table. She remembered how many years she spent at this very spot, worrying about whether they were eating well, sleeping well, living well, whether she was enough, whether she was too much, whether she was invisible or simply inconvenient. She thought giving everything would return something. Maybe gratitude, maybe closeness, maybe love. But somewhere along the way, her care became currency. Her kindness became a resource. Her motherhood became a contract she never signed. Today, for the first time, she saw it clearly. The weight that was never hers to CARY. Parents aren't built to be worshipped. They're not built to be obeyed or repaid. They're not built to guarantee outcomes. They are built to love. But love, real love, never disappears when money does. And what her children wanted was not her love. It was her legacy, her future, her end. That truth stung more sharply than anything they had said. But it also freed her, because once something is seen for what it truly is, it can no longer pretend to be something else. The realization she never expected to, for Natalie, stood. Slowly, her knees aching in that familiar way they did when rain was coming. She walked to the window, where the yard was still wet with dew, where she once watched her children run barefoot, fearless, where she once believed they were growing into people who would carry her stories, her lessons, her memories, people who would carry her. But children grow into adults who make choices, and sometimes those choices detour away from the hearts that raised them. She finally whispered a sentence she never imagined. They don't love me the way I love them. No, the truth was cold. It didn't crush her, because she finally saw the difference between losing something and letting it go. The life that begins after the surrender. Natalie boiled water for tea, her motions slow but steady. The kettle hummed, and she let its warmth guide her. She was alone now, truly alone. But the absence felt honest, uncomplicated, real. She thought about the people who had shown her kindness without expecting anything back. The caretaker, the neighbor, the charity volunteer who visited twice a week just to talk about books. People who asked about her, not her estate. People who saw the woman, not the will. People who gave, even when they had nothing to gain. And suddenly, Natalie understood why she had written their names instead. Because love is not blood. Love is behavior. Love is presence. And love real, untransactional. It's unmeasured. Love is rare and precious, and often arrives from unexpected places. The decision she owns. Fully unows, we walked into the living room and picked up the envelope containing her will. She didn't open it. She didn't need to. The decision had been made long before she ever wrote a word. and today proved that it's not a betrayal, it was a boundary. A final act of self-respect in a life where she had been taught to never choose herself. Natalie placed the envelope back in the drawer. This time, when she closed it, her hand didn't shake. What her children believed was the end was actually the beginning, a beginning she had earned. The quiet Vistuzer wide that night. She stepped outside before bed. The sky was scattered with stars, gentle, distant, steady. The air was cool against her skin. She breathed in deeply and felt something she hadn't felt in decades. Ownership of her own life, her own choices, her own peace, her own ending. Her children might never understand why she did what she did. They might never forgive her. They might never come back. But for the first time, Natalie wasn't waiting at the door. She wasn't apologizing for choosing herself. She wasn't shrinking to make others comfortable. She wasn't bargaining with love that had conditions. She stood under the open sky, finally unburdened. The world was quiet, and in that quiet, she heard something she once feared she would never hear again. Her own heart still beating, still steady, still hers.